Good afternoon or good morning, depending on the time zone that you might be tuning in from today. Thank you for coming back to another session here at Lendit Fintech. My name is Todd Anderson. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Lendit. We got another great panel webinar ahead of us today. Best practices and pitfalls for using open source components in fintech. Before I turn it over to Simon, Jeff, Isaac, and Steve, just a quick couple of announcements for you, the audience. So first, we want your participation. So if at any point you have a question, something comes to mind, use the Q&A box and enter that question. Don't use the chat, use the Q&A function. If there's a technical issue, you need a phone number to call into, put that in the chat, but otherwise put your questions in that Q&A box. You'll see the Q&A box window in your Zoom and click that. It'll pop out. You can ask your questions. Secondly, on to Lendit Fintech USA. We have a couple of in-person events coming up this year. So please check out lendit.com/USA and you'll check out all the details there. Lots of great sponsors, speakers, and it's 2 days in New York City in May. And Lendit TV, you'll see this webinar and other webinars on our library. So check that out at your leisure, tv.lendit.com. And now to Simon and the group for our panel discussion today. Simon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Todd, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. And we hope to have some really good conversation today about everything from, I guess, developer adoption of the security all the way through to how developers can still be innovative with highly regulated areas such as fintech or other verticals. So why don't we first of all say hello to everyone who's here joining us today. Steve is going to be along shortly as well, hopefully. So why don't we start with myself actually. So my name's Simon Maple. I'm going to be the moderator today. I'm the field CTO here at Snyk, and I've been at Snyk for 4 years or so. My background is very heavily in the engineering space. So I've been an engineer for 20 years commercially. Joining me on the panel, why don't we start with Jeff Lush. Jeff Lush. Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Peak 6, who you work for?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Simon. My background is very similar to yours. I'm an engineer by trade. I've spent the last 20 years helping companies build open source software, comply with open source licenses, and deal with open source security vulnerabilities. I've been at Peak 6 for about a year. And if you're not familiar with Peak 6, we're a global fintech provider. We create trading software, financial education software, insurance education software, as well as we even have a esports gaming team, believe it or not. So we deal with a lot of aspects of fintech. We deal with a lot of languages, so Java, Python, Go, anything you can imagine in the modern fintech stack we've been dealing with. And the company's about 25 years old. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today around open source.
Awesome. Well, welcome. And also joining us today is Isaac Avery. Isaac works for a company called Scylla in the UK, I believe. Isaac, not in the UK, in the US. Isaac, tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Scylla as well.
Yeah, thank you. So Scylla is a relatively new company beside Peak 6. We've been around for about 4 years now. I've been with the company for 3 years. I am VP of engineering there. My background is primarily in engineering management, last 15 years or so. Similar background in engineering. We're engineering heavy crowd today. Scylla is a API banking platform providing payments and compliance as a service to fintech software development teams. And yeah, that's what we exist for.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Isaac. And Steve, who will be joining us very shortly, he's literally webinar hopping, so he's just finishing up another webinar and he'll be on soon. Steve is from Snyk as well, and we'll introduce him when he arrives. So why don't we start with really one of the kind of like core topics of why security is changing, which is really some of the underlying development changes that have occurred to our organizations and teams by choice. So Isaac, starting with you, what do you feel are some of the more modern developer practices that have maybe shaken up the way we have done security, in the past, what we need to change. So what have been the big changes that have affected that?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go, but yeah, obviously the breaking out DevOps and kind of the shift from compliance, trying to figure out where compliance fits in kind of the new regime is an interesting dynamic, and probably one of the biggest challenges to solve right now as in the fintech space. And I think that's probably kind of bridging the gap between development and operational security, and who owns that space is what we're all trying to figure out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, yeah, you really nailed it there. I think with the kind of like I guess more of that DevOps movement, whereby development teams are trying to be more independent, more autonomous, outside of maybe more of the centralized unit that we have. One of the other areas I suspect is the increased use of open source, which developers tend to take a lot on as well. And I guess it'd be interesting to know, Jeff, from your point of view, devs are using open source more and more. What are the kind of core dangers of open source among developers? And I guess in terms of Peak 6, how does Peak 6 deal with some of the dangers or issues that the open source usage brings?
Sure. I think one of the big changes is we've moved from a world of kind of commercial software. You had a POC, a contract, an NDA, and a sales team and all that, to line level engineers having a lot of independence in terms of what they use. And so our processes and procedures of the whole industry need to catch up with that. So what do we do? At Peak 6, for example, we treat open source usage very seriously. So we have an open source office. We have a director of open source. That's my job, is to help manage the process of using, securing, complying, and contributing to the open source world. One thing you also see is that the sheer amount of software that's being used is orders of magnitude more than even 5 or 10 years ago. A typical bill of materials, so the list of all the third-party software we use, is running to thousands of individuals now. So thousands of libraries for a common large project that we manage. So our processes have to scale up to work with that, as at the same time as a shifting left, independent engineers bringing in open source a package at a time. So at Peak 6 and other fintech companies, you're starting to see open source offices. You hear them called OSPOs appear. We have a working group which involves engineering, both senior and junior engineers, compliance teams, legal teams, marketing teams, even both for internal and external marketing. And we use this to basically communicate how do we manage the use of open source, the security issues. We just saw recently with Log4j, it touched every aspect of the company to manage the response to that security issue. What else do we do? We use software composition analysis tools, which is basically open source scanning, to discover the use of open source. If you just ask individuals, oh, what are we using? You'll get a list of 5, 10 components. We know we're using thousands of components. So we need a technology to manage that, kind of keep watch. So I get an alert on Saturday saying, ooh, new issue. We can deal with that at that point or on Monday when we come in. And we also contribute back to the open source world. So we just don't take, we give back. And that could be bug fixes, that could be small code contributions. We even have a GitHub with open source projects that we manage the community around and have given back. So those are the things I think as a fintech company, you're going to add slices of those periodically as you grow and your use of open source increases. But those are types of things that we do at Peak 6.
And that's really interesting, Isaac. I'd like to kind of ask you a question here about how with the way that DevOps really brings developers in to make decisions by themselves, to empower them, to be more autonomous, to be more independent, this kind of like builds a model where security aren't necessarily the group that you reach out to say, oh, can we use this every single time? So you end up with developer teams that are being more autonomous, more independent, and actually kind of partly sometimes doing maybe what they want to, and sometimes just using what they need to actually deliver that product. So in terms of things like the SBOMs that Jeff was talking, how much harder is it in the modern DevOps processes to keep track and keep hold of these SBOMs and libraries effectively that we are bringing into the organization?
Interesting question. Two parts to that. Keeping track, I think there's a number of providers, both open source and commercial, who actually make it fairly easy to keep track. Keeping hold on that and managing that, that's an entirely different story. So yeah, I mean, it's not just about the SBOM, although that is a core component, but you have to start at design time, and your architecture you have to design for that. Shifting left and giving that autonomy to the developers. These automated tools make it fantastic to be able to do that and still ensure you have security when those are shipped. Or there's also audits and scans that need to be run regularly, and those will help inform. And I think it's really defense in depth and just having all of those in concert and having everybody working coordinated and still having that centralized security owning that entire space and the definition of the policies to manage that.
Mm-hmm. So it's the security team that own almost like the guardrails or the policies, the that kind of group. And from the development point of view, and I think we'll get into ownership in a little bit, but from the development point of view, do they need to take the responsibility for their decisions there, or are they more pushing that over to the security side, would you say?
No, they own it. They have the accountability. It's done in concert. At least it still is done in concert, where the developer has the responsibility to select the package and ensure it's compliant. DevOps has the responsibility to ensure that controls are in place to manage that and to assist with maintaining that auditable trail. And then QA has the responsibility to verify that all of those are compliant, secure, and fully tested.
Mm-hmm. And I guess with the changes that we're talking about here, where the development teams get more of that responsibility, that accountability somewhat about those kind of decisions, in fintech and other highly regulated industries, healthcare and other places like that, the regulations, the compliances that are required to adhere to do business in these industries are going to be a lot more stringent in terms of the development practices and that auditability, etc. Jeff, why don't we come to you here and really, I'd love to hear from your side what you feel the impact, I guess, of moving from a more traditional security model that we saw 10, 15 years ago to more of the DevSecOps models now. At what stage does regulations or compliance actually say, you know what, we can't do these things in this industry because of these regulations? What are we, being told we can't do as a result of these?
I think what we're seeing is the regulations coming in just when the industry is actually able to manage them. If the regulations around software bills and material came out 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have been able to manage it. If they would have been empty promises. Oh, you need a software bill of materials, but the technology wouldn't have been there, the training wouldn't have been there, the experience wouldn't have been there. We see that now. And I think the acceleration caused due to things like Log4j in December, where teams said, we don't know what we have. We don't know where we're using this. We don't know how to fix it. We don't know if our vendors are impacted, and so on and so on. So what we're seeing now is, in the US, we had the recent Biden cybersecurity order. It basically says start thinking about this if you're working in the federal space. We've seen a lot of more acceleration around banking and worldwide adoption of at least bill of materials. And I think that's the first shot over the bow, which is where we should be expecting as an industry that we need to know every piece of open source and every piece of commercial code that we're using. We need to have a vulnerability management plan in place. If we don't come up with one will be dictated to us by the governments of the world. So we should be ahead of that. And you don't want to be caught unaware. So you don't want to be told when you sign a contract, oh, we need a bill of materials tomorrow, or the law just came in place and your whole company should have been prepared for this. There's a process to get there. I always use the analogy. It's like you've inherited a warehouse. You don't know what's in those boxes. You don't know how it got there. You have a year to clean it up. You don't want to wait 365 days to clean up all those boxes. You got to start now and figure out what's going on. And how we've built software is the same way. We've put boxes in the warehouse, but we really haven't done a good job managing it. But the laws are coming in place to saying you need to manage it well. Know what you have, know when problems occur, and have a change management plan in place to quickly fix anything that's problematic. So we should expect that, and it's already here. Yeah, like we shouldn't be looking to the future. Like we know that SBOMs are required now in our industry.
Yeah, and is that, would you say that's specific to the fintech space, or harsher in the fintech space than other verticals?
I think we should expect it in the fintech space a little sooner, because there's so much money involved, because there's so much government oversight and regulation already. It's just really easy just to add another paragraph to some existing regulation that's there. So I'm fully expecting open source management to be a requirement sooner rather than later. We may see this in healthcare. We may see this in other places as well. I think a lot of things rhyme in our industry. So if there's health and safety, if there's a lot of money, if there's aviation involved, anything that involves life, health, safety, or lots of money, you should expect open source regulation in the near term.
Yeah. Okay. And actually, we this is a fun fact actually for anyone out there. If you mention compliance or regulation, Steve magically always appears on that Zoom call, which is incredible. Steve, we're certainly tiring you out with webinars. Welcome to this webinar. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and Snyk as well.
Sure. So sorry I'm late, everyone. I just happened to be coming off a call with Kevin Mitnick. It was a bucket list thing. It was great. So I'm Steve Kinman. I'm the field CISO at Snyk. I just been here about 6 months, and I was an operational CISO before that for an e-commerce company in Germany. And so, compliance and regulatory with GDPR are near and dear to my heart. I don't know how much Simon told you about Snyk, but Snyk is really trying to be developer first security. We want to put the tool in the hands of the responsible teams to remediate security vulnerabilities and issues. As a security CISO, everything I did up until now was reactive. We always threw the things back over the wall to developers, and they said we were slowing them down, we were stopping innovation, we were crushing them or securing them to bankruptcy. You'll hear a lot, and that's not what we're trying to do. But we're accountable. If we had a breach, the CISO is going to get chopped, right? He's going to be the accountable person for that breach, but he's really not responsible. So Snyk really tries to put that responsibility back where it belongs, in the teams that build products and developers and engineers. So anyway, we can always wrap compliance and regulatory things around all of that. And I stumbled in at the SBOM discussion, and hey, I'm all for them. Bring them on. Let's make it, I don't know if I want it to be forced on me, but I would love to be the bringer of SBOMs to the world, because I think it's super important. And anyway, I'll try to get caught back up on where you guys are now, and we'll go.
Awesome, thank you, Stephen. Welcome. So Isaac, I'd love to come to you from the while talking about compliance and regulation from the development point of view, from your like engineering perspective. What are the regulations and compliance? Is anything blocking you? Is anything stopping you from achieving what you want to do, or is this is this something more of a checkbox that we kind of like need to do while adding security measures in a slightly different way? How much does this help versus hinder you from your point of view?
From my perspective, it 100% helps, and partially, I'd say regulation or not. I mean, this is just best practice. This is something that knowing what you're using, what your stack is critically important to maintaining operational security, and I don't see any way that this hinders. This doesn't slow you down if you're already doing it. To Steve's point, there are some, sure, you can secure yourself into bankruptcy. That is a concept, but I don't see this being even a significant contributor to that. This instead unlocks the ability for developers to be autonomous, to say, hey, I'm using this. I know that the system's going to add this to the list, it's going to scan it, it's going to be 100% verified, and it's going to get kicked back if not.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit also about where you say this is going to be kicked back if not. There's obviously everyone has different restrictions, I guess, during their pipeline when they want to deliver code. Some people will like gates that are completely blocking if a specific type of vulnerability appears. Others will have SLAs where you can raise a ticket, Jira ticket perhaps, and then have that issue fixed within a certain time period. In terms of whether gates are needed or what your approaches are to implementing gates, how do you do that in your I guess respective experiences in work? Isaac, why don't we start with you?
Sure. It's an iterative process. There's never a point at which the SDLC, the development pipeline, is going to be completely done. But you start with the low-hanging fruit and you improve on it. Getting that SBOM in place and saying, I know what's there, right? That's step one. Getting that integrated with your release pipeline, that can come, well, it's a very subjective thing. It can come later. Having that gate in place is the point at which it's not a retroactive, we have to do a scan every 3 months and remediate this list. It's a proactive, I know that anything that goes to production is vetted, and I know that if there's any security vulnerability downstream, it's going to surface immediately. So it is an iterative thing, but I think that's the goal, is to have as much of that in depth. Actually, it doesn't just need to be one tool, but having as many of those gates as are fully, you're caught up, you're cleaned, you're now ready to implement the gate and say, everything from here on out is going to have to stay clean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess a gate is great in the sense of, oh gosh, I'm glad that didn't go into production from the dev point of view. But equally at the same time, builds breaking is always an annoyance and a frustration for developers. And I guess there's a balance here between the frustration of development teams versus the benefit it gives them. And I guess Jeff, how do we know where that balance is, first of all, and how do we get to that balance where it works? Because obviously, as Isaac said, you can't just snap your fingers and all of a sudden all these gates are in place and everyone knows exactly what's to do and what not to do.
I got to say, for the last 20 years, in my working in this industry here, I always hear from senior management, I want a hard gate. I want to block check-ins. I want to break the build. I want red alerts to go off. And whenever you give somebody that, you say, okay, well, we don't think it's a good idea. Well, you do it. There's a revolt in engineering. They say, you don't understand what it takes to get software shipped. And you broke the build at 11:59 on Friday when I shouldn't be working anyway. And I have to call in IT and I believe there's a really great place for soft gates. So alerting, basically Christmas trees, things like that. Maybe sometime down the line, a couple of years from now, maybe we'll see more and more of a need for a hard gate. Or if you're in certain industries, maybe a really strong hard gate around certain open source licenses for compliance purposes. But for security right now, I think we're still in the land of soft gates, where you might have release criteria, but I would not recommend breaking the build. I would not recommend blocking builds and blocking check-ins at this state right now. Maybe with a little more education, a little more cleanup in the software supply chain, changing in tooling and changing in expectations, sure. But I think we're still in that soft gate world. And we're also adding other gates that perhaps didn't exist in the past. So right now we very much are talking about check-ins and going to production and things like that. A lot of the open source issues are not present when you push to production. You grab the top of tree, it's great. It's still, steam is still coming off the pie. You've shipped it. It's 6 months down the line. It's a year down the line when you've been sitting in production where the open source vulnerability is discovered. It's always been there, but it's been discovered and now published. So we're going to be adding some additional gates, and those might become more of a hard gate, more hard alerts. When Log4j came out, that's Thursday night at 9 o'clock, call your CISO type of alert, as opposed to a minor build issue. So I think we're going to see the gates change, and I'm still on the side of soft gates if pulled.
Yeah, and I guess Steve, through a pipeline, there are many places in which we can have gates. There's we're just about to hit production, and this is a gate which may want to break a build, depending, I guess, like both Isaac and Jeff were saying, depending on the organization. Some might prefer soft, some might prefer harder gates, but there are other places in which we can perform these alerts, maybe in GitHub, maybe in IDEs and things like that. In terms of a developer pushing into a pipeline, where do you feel what value do you feel like a Git repo test can have over and above, say, a CI test or something that's closer to production?
So, not a developer by trade, more security team, but I always run into this problem from the security side where an auditor or a regulatory body comes in and wants to know that you have something in place, right? And so I think that's where the challenge is like, if you as developers and developer first security and that focus can put this earlier into the process, and you can have notifications, you could have awareness of everything in the SBOM and get notifications when a vulnerability shows up 6 months down the road, like Jeff mentioned. The key there is making sure that the information security teams or governance teams or whatever you have that visibility, and it's automated. I mean, that would be like pie in the sky dream, right? Because then when the auditor comes in, I can say, we use this, and they say, show me, and I can say, here you go. And that's really the thing. So you're making yourself more secure. You're building in security, privacy, data protection, whatever you want by design. And then you're able to show that later in the where you need it. And I think that's key.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question, but that's
I mean, I think it's an important area, and I think that automation, which you kind of like mentioned, is really key, particularly like when we talk about these pipelines. There are so many places whereby we can add this automation in and have this testing done for us rather than being manually done by a developer. It can be it's an important aspect of it. I guess one question perhaps to Isaac here. When we talk about the changes that have kind of like gone on in development, one of the big shifts in application design is really going to be cloud native applications using containers more, using infrastructure as code more. The role of a developer has changed massively in terms of what they're expected to touch in a production environment. I remember 20 years ago when I had my first dev job, it's the classic, I wrote some code, I throw it over a wall, someone else handles it and puts it into operations. Today, if you need to tweak a container, you need to write some infrastructure, you can do it as code, and developers often have a hand in that. What do we need to change about the way developers view the security impact that they need to consider for their applications that they write? Or is this just an extension and responsibility with other practices like security and performance, etc., beyond the typical app that a developer would need to write?
It seems to me, at least from my experience, that shift is already happening in providing security training to developers, getting developers aware of security implications of your cloud configurations, your whatever template you happen to be using. There's security configurations there, and I don't think it's fair to say across the board that developers are not savvy to that. That said, there does have to be a centralized, somebody accountable to it, some role accountable to it, who takes ownership of that, ensures that training is provided, and that all changes implemented have been verified. So there has to be some level of involvement, but I think it's collaborative. I don't think it's just a either or.
Yeah,
I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, no, it did, and I think Obviously with a lot of the infrastructure as code and a lot of the increase in misconfigurations perhaps versus maybe with static analysis of your code, the difference there being you tend to write it and then you tend to find issues in that, whether it's bugs or software issues. With infrastructure as code, for example, it tends to be more very often what you don't write, what you omit, and you can kind of like really pull in insecure defaults. Do you feel there is a bigger educational piece there that developers need to understand before copy pasting code there or infrastructure as code, or do you think this is actually a similar problem to what we've experienced in the past?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely more training needed to be provided there. The way we actually handle that is we just have DevOps, DevSecOps, whatever you want to call it. In our case, it's security and DevOps are integrated, but they own that space. So any changes made by the developers are run through DevOps, and DevOps is aware of them and audits them when they are made. And that checks that box for us for now. As we grow, as we scale, that's going to become more and more difficult to manage, granted. But I think it's, again, still a combination. I really think the developers need to be aware of that. I don't think, I think they want to be aware of it. And I think, giving them the ability to work with DevOps and say, hey, here's the change that I made. Can you PR this? Can you implement this? And then having the feedback from that gives them a contextual training and the experience to say, oh, I know that next time that's going to be something that we can solve. And then from there, that knowledge naturally tends to spread from senior developers to juniors and so on and so forth. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, no, interesting. And actually, let's get a little bit further into the, I guess, the training and somewhat the education while we're there. And Jeff, I'll kind of like ask about I guess training and awareness, particularly with that decentralized model that we're all kind of like striving for, where you have these individual teams that want to run more in isolation, or not more in isolation, but more independently. What are the challenges really to get the right education to each of those teams, and how can we make sure that they're at the right level to be able to contribute the necessary code?
Sure, and I think it's a great question. I think it's something our industry has not always done a great job on. So, if we look at open source in particular, it kind of came in through the back door. Developers have started bringing in open source and said, this is great. This is the best way for me to build my new product, build our systems. But some things were not, some things are not taught in university or in onboarding. So open source license compliance, security awareness, managing vulnerabilities. Those are all things that we don't learn in our CS degree. We don't learn that on our onboarding, but we need to. So for example, at our company now, we have made that part of our onboarding training. So what is a CVE? What is a CVSS score? How do you manage these vulnerabilities? How do you triage? How do you understand what is worse type of defect than others? Same thing with licensing. So that is something that I think as an industry, we need to start adding to our own kind of training modules. So governance, security, compliance, et cetera. I think we also see as the change in how we kind of stand up systems, we also need to train our developers on a little bit more like IT security folks. So I always joke, I can't roll a 1U server into our machine room. People with armed guards would stop me. But I can spin up a Docker image or a container on Kubernetes, and it's basically the same thing. So what do we need to do to train our developers to understand what is the impact of spinning up a new operating system, spinning up a new container? How do we manage the monitoring there? How do we manage understanding the provenance of where that image came from? And does it have long-term stability? Is it coming from an open source project that we think is going to survive for a year or 5 years or 10 years? Should we build our 1 year, 5 year, 10 year plan on that? So that's all part of the education. And it's also something that is not a one and done. So yes, it's part of onboarding, but you also need to look at your senior developers. Just because they've been with you for 5 years or 10 years, they probably didn't get that education before. So bring them in as well. So we all have that same base level of knowledge. And also look and see where your mistakes are coming in. You're going to be doing scanning. You're going to be doing monitoring. You're going to see where the problems are coming in terms of how you respond. It's another great place to throw your training at and say, do we keep having the same problem because of a lack of training? And then on the
Yeah.
flip side, I won't go too deep into this, but giving back to the open source world, that also requires a level of training as well. You just can't throw code over the wall and expect it to survive. So bringing in code and using code as certain training aspects, and also releasing code as open source. And that's a whole other webinar that we can get into. So.
Yeah, and I like the idea of you mentioned about training senior people who have been there a little while as well. And Isaac, back to your point about having senior people or people in other teams, whether it's the DevOps teams, looking through changes and providing that input is I guess from that point, you're really saying that code reviews, etc., having the right people on who can provide those responses, that's effectively a form of either education or that reiterating that education to make sure people are doing the right thing. Code reviews, how important would you say they are to kind of like mandate across all changes that are made through your environments?
Absolutely. We do code reviews on 100% of our code, and that's it's not only an effective well, I'll use the term gate because we're throwing it around here, but it's also a very effective training and collaboration. Like it really is the bread and butter and the lifeblood of the development process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's a great way to, adding security into those code reviews is an important way to make it a first-class citizen in that development process as well. Steve, please do.
If I don't mind, if I can add one more thing, which is we've also rolled out mentoring and security champions and open source champions, which I think is an important part of the education. It's not just sit down and have a webinar and a PowerPoint slide forever. We do a lot of almost like pair programming, where we have the senior person and a junior person and the security person come in, and they work together on dealing with open source issues. And I think we don't always look at that as education, but it's an important part of getting everybody with this open source and security knowledge in your organization.
Yeah, no, it's
still your moderator role for 30 seconds and ask Jeff what the adoption rates of that are. How do you get the developers involved in that, and is it working?
It's work at Peak 6. I find it work because we do have a champion. We have an open source director who can come in and say, yes, this is going to be the way it is. I've seen this at other organizations where they've made that part of senior engineering management. So it's just a part of like your CTO or VP role to say, this is how we're going to build software, and here's what we expect. But you have to, that manager has to also make sure that it happens. If you just throw the email out and don't have any sort of you just have trust but not verification, it doesn't happen. But you need this. If you say a year from now, 2 years from now, we're going to have open source security as our bread and butter of an engineering team, you have to get the training in place. You have to get that mentoring in place, and you have to confirm that it's happening. So it's, if you have that engineering buy-in, leadership buy-in, it happens. If it's, as people have said, hope is not a strategy. You can't hope yourself to success.
Yeah.
Sorry, Simon, I'll turn it back over to you now. Thanks, Jeff.
No, I was actually going to ask you a question, actually, quite similar, Stephen, just in terms of, getting developers to adopt security practices, getting developers to shift security left. Obviously, security are always going to approve that kind of a message of developers getting more and more involved. But how can you enable developers in that dev first approach? What are some of the core ways in which you can do that?
I like what Jeff said about security champions. I think that's a big part of it. But additionally, I think giving them control earlier in the process, in the life cycle, right? So if, I'll just say it, Snyk has Snyk Learn, and it shows you a vulnerability, and it shows you why it's important, what risk it is, and how to remediate it right there. And if you can give that to a developer early, instead of having to reach out to a security architect or reach out to a security team, that slows them down and lets them be more innovative and in the action and get it closed quickly, kind of in an automated way, I think that's huge. I think back to my role as a CISO, everything was reactive, like I mentioned, and we were always harassing these teams, begging, borrowing, trying to steal their time, 10% of your time. And it really did slow them down and stop their thought process. And I think something like Snyk Learn and having that automated fashion to do pull requests that fix things is very important. Not to just talk about Snyk, but I think that's big.
Mhm. Awesome. So we're going to go into some Q&A. So feel free for people who are watching, if they have any burning questions, would love to hear some of the questions that you have. I have a few here that have come in. First one, what are the most important things to consider when selecting the tools for creating a software bill of material, an SBOM, and other artifacts during the development workflow, so CI/CD, DevOps, and the pipeline? Can you give any thoughts about what makes those tools, what are the things to consider when looking at those tools? Isaac, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'd say it's difficult to know until you've tried which one's going to, what each one's going to do. So our approach is to, try a few and compare the results and see how they work. It obviously depends on your stack and where what your industry is. I mean, we're all kind of in the similar industries anyhow, but there's no one specific product that you can just say this one is hands and feet above anything else. That said, there is a lot of research that's been done on this, and that's where we started, and then just implemented a few and compared the results, and we actually run multiples for defense and dev.
Awesome. And Jeff, same question to you.
Very similar answer. I think this is the type of tool space that you actually have to run on your own system. So you might have historical code like Java that many tools might work for, but you might be using new languages like Go, which are not well supported by different vendors in the space. So running a proof of concept, running tests on both your old historical code plus your new code, you might have different needs. You might be in the IoT space versus the fintech space, and there may be different levels of analysis that you might need. So that's something to look at. And also just the developer experience. If you just have like a person run a proof of concept and say, oh, this works for me, but you haven't run that against the developers, or especially folks who don't live and breathe open source or live and breathe compliance or security, it's really important to bring in a line level developer to say, try out tool A, try out tool B. Does this actually work? And sometimes you'll actually see cases where they're doing like random access scanning. They like the tool so much, they're getting ahead of the proof of concept. And that's a really good sign to see. And that's something that I've looked at when I've whatever the space is, SaaS, DAST, SCA, you want to see developer engagement with the tools, because they're going to be the folks, they're not paying for it, but they're using it. And you want the users to be excited.
Which can often be the difference between shelfware and something that devs actually use. And I think one thing I'll also add there, which I think is very important, is reaching out to contacts, networks, and being able to say, hey, what are you using for this? What's your opinion? Because I also think, pilots being, a couple of weeks or a week, there is a certain amount that you can learn from those. There's also a certain amount that, when you're doing it at scale, you can also learn a lot from those kind of discussions. Steve, I'm not sure if I should ask a vendor this kind of a question, but what would you say are the most important things to add on selecting a security tool like this?
So I'm just going to give you a different answer than you expect. As a security guy, I want the pie in the sky answer, right? So I want, if you've ever watched Amazon Prime Video and you pause a movie and it shows you X-ray, that's what I want. I want the SBOM X-ray. I want to be able to ask Alexa, am I affected by Log4j? And something to say, yes, this application, this components, this microservice, this container, this image has a vulnerability, and I want it to be continuously monitored. So 6 months down the road, when the new vulnerability comes out, I actually get a notification that says, hey, this application is affected and you need to go do these things with these pull requests. And it should all be automated. So if any of you are good developers and can invent that for a security team guy like me, I would be happy to do that. Now, yes, I am the vendor guy, right? So we are heading that way at Snyk. We're trying to get to what we call application security posture management, where we have this kind of visibility and this kind of technology for your software supply chain, for the pipelines you use for your builds and things like that. But that's just my pie in the sky dream. So please make that happen, and then I can sleep at night.
Thank you, Steve. So yeah, another question around the different types of tools. So obviously, open source tools versus commercial tools. Are open source tools as good as the commercial ones, or would it be easier and cheaper in the end, to buy a commercial license? Jeff, any thoughts on that?
I have used all the tools. I use all the tools, much like Isaac saying, defense at depth. I think it's really important to understand the limitations of whether it's the open source or the commercial tools. I do think managing a database has always been difficult for some of the open source side versus commercial tooling. And when it comes to vulnerabilities and project health and things like that, that is something that I look at when I'm looking at open source versus commercial. It depends on the types of things you need to manage. And I think that's what you get out of doing a POC. And I think it's important to do, whether it's bringing in open source or commercial tools, making sure that your needs are being met. Sometimes, I've used tools as well saying, oh yeah, we have that. We have SCA as a feature, and you run a scan and it just doesn't get you what you need. It gives you a checkbox that maybe as a manager, you might say, oh yes, we have SCA. We have open source management. But when it comes to me saying, I need to defend my company, I need to respect the open source world, I want full feature. So it really comes down to actually running it and seeing that your needs are being met.
And Isaac, I guess the question, where does open source beat commercial tools, and where does commercial tools beat open source?
That's an interesting way to rephrase it. Primary benefit, obviously, to open source is lower cost of entry, at least, and more availability. I think in my experience, the primary advantage to commercial is, at least of the results that I've seen, they tend to be a little bit more complete, or at least a little bit more updated. But I don't necessarily buy it has to be one or the other. I agree with Jeff. Try them all. See which one works best. Compare the results against an audit or a composition scan, and see where it comes out, and then choose the best one for your stack, for your industry, your environment, whatever.
Or multiple, as you mentioned before as well.
Oh yeah, or your for vendors.
And I think there's an important aspect of getting a bill of materials out and getting the whole kind of alerting ecosystem. And that's another thing that I think often gets missed on the, I did a one and done scan and, oh, look, A versus B. It's, can I live with this as, does my company safer because we have alerting, because we have prioritization? Those are things that you might not just get from a bill of material to bill of material comparison. It's the whole system around managing and alerting and supporting your open source dependencies. And it's another thing to think about when you're doing the comparison.
Yeah. Thanks. And actually, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. The third question come in here as well. And if there's any other questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A tab. So the last question: what are some strategies for driving developer adoption of security practices? So I guess in terms of whether it's a security team wanting to get a development team to use a tool or a practice, what are some of the strategies that can be done to help that? I think security champions was. Oh, sorry, Steve. I think security champions was mentioned. Perhaps there's others as well.
I've tried quite a bit of strategies here, but security champions did seem to work. Nurturing it and keeping it going became the challenge. So I think that's something you have to keep in mind. I think you have to make it special for the champions you find. You have to give them something, whether it's swag and t-shirts saying they're security champions, or maybe it's a bump in, a bonus or something like that for taking this interest. But security champions is definitely one way. I think you have to stay heavily involved in the awareness training and showing why security is important. Not everyone that's a developer is going to be interested in security. So if you're trying to build that culture of security, you have to be able to show them the why it's important. Real world exercises, how an exploit is really attacked and things like that. And I think that goes a long way, instead of just saying, because security told you so, or we have a mandate, or we have the CTO on our side. Those kind of cause a wall and some abrasiveness there. I think you have to get into the mind of the developer, start thinking like the developer, like we do with Snyk. We try to make it a security tool hidden as a developer tool, so or disguised as a developer tool. So I think you have to do the same thing with your training and your awareness. And I think
yeah. And Jeff, anything to add there?
Yeah, a couple things there. I think there's kind of concrete things. So like the top down and bottom up approaches. So top down, where engineering management says, hey, I don't see, open source management or vulnerability management on your plans. Like, I need to see, was it 5%, 10%? Give me some number. If it's not there, I don't expect you're doing it. So pushing back. So senior leadership should be pushing back and saying, I don't see vulnerability management. I don't see open source management. And it's 2022. Log4j just showed us if we ignore it, it's going to make, if we don't make time for it, it's going to make time for us. So top down needs to be there. Bottom up, I think the tooling, the education, that is all great. If you don't have good tools, if you don't have good education, people don't want to do it. And also giving them the time. It's not like, oh, I guess what, you are punished by being interested in security. It shouldn't be over on top of your normal day-to-day job. It should be carved out as part of somebody. Somebody is the owner at first, and as time goes on, we all no one's the open source SCM Git expert. Their one job. Everybody's expected to have at least a layer of knowledge there. And open source vulnerability management is going to be like that when we fast forward a year or two. So, So I think that's the important aspect.
And on your top-down example there, I think one of the great ways that I've seen a number of companies do similar thing is through scorecards, and it's like there's very much a transparency angle there as well as a visibility one to be able to say these business units, this is how they're, and not just security, of course, lots of other things as well, but showing security metrics, etc. Could be anything from education taken to vulnerabilities that are existing through to practices that are being done by various teams, and it's a great way to be able to provide the engineering managers, the VPs, the CTOs, etc., with the information they need to be able to say, hey, this month to last month, we're actually getting worse. Let's try and fix this. And it gives that visibility and transparency to teams to be held accountable to those kind of things. It's a really important area that I've seen work well as well. Isaac, anything to add on that last point around driving developer adoption of security practices?
I think the only thing I would add to that is, and both Jeff and Steve kind of alluded to this, but I would go so far as to say, it shouldn't be here's the developers, here's the security, let's disguise this as a developer tool or vice versa. But development and security should be a part of engineering. It's all a part of the bigger picture. Every developer should view themselves as a part of the security team, and the security team should be collaborating with and utilizing the developer team as they're responsible for implementing security controls. And I think getting the developers involved in security audits, in reviewing the findings in a scan, that not everybody's going to be interested in that, but the ones that are, that will make them inherently heavily invested in security. They'll see the need for it. They'll start to understand where that's going and why this has to be this way. And then from there, again, I think it just is a natural training opportunity for the engineers that are involved in that, then work with the others and say, hey, no, I caught this in a PR. We can't do that because of this vulnerability. We can't use that. And then it just naturally grows from there. And I think, breaking down that wall, that barrier between security and engineering is critical, or security and development.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful point. Well put. So thank you very much. And I think we'll end it there. So from me personally, thank you very, very much to Isaac, Jeff, and to Steve. And thank you all for watching. I'll pass over to Todd. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Simon. And thank you to the panel. Special thanks to the team at Snyk for their support. Without support like yours and partners like you guys, we cannot do these webinars and also our large scale in-person events. So thank you for the support. Thank you to the audience, as always, for tuning in. We'll be back soon with another webinar. So check out lendit.com webinars, and everyone else, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you much.